but it's a bad situation. You don't have police reflect the neighborhood that the people are from, and they ain't from the neighborhood. I don't know. I don't see how that ever could get right. We need police from the outside.
You know, Chuck, your point about policing and absolute power in other countries is a good one to maybe look at what's happening, for example, in Greece, in other places. In one African country that I won't mention, light-skinned people are called Obroni, which means white. And therefore, but you know that. So therefore, there's a open season, I won't say open season, but people are free to hassle you because you're a Brony. And so things happen in airports and other places where the police, I won't say they handcuff you unjustly, but you notice that you're getting, you know, sort of this equivalent of stop and frisk. Again, because you're a Brony. So some of the whole thing about policing is absolute power. Why do they, because one guy told me, why are you stopping me? Because I can.
So race fatigue reminds me of Katrina fatigue. There was a point where people started saying, well, there's Katrina fatigue. And all the people in New Orleans were like, no, you want to talk Katrina fatigue? Come here and help me dig out my house, and I'll talk to you about fatigue around Katrina. And I think race fatigue is, I mean, it's almost it's almost silly, right? It is people's lives. And it's never something that should fatigue you, other than the people who sometimes are dealing with issues on a daily basis, which can be exhausting. Some days, you know, when a young man who's in our documentary, and we'll show clips of our documentary this evening, you know, his mom says, like, it can make you lose your mind when you're stopped every single day on your way to your college classes, when you're pushed up against the wall, and because you fit the description over and over and over again. Like, it can make you feel like you're going to lose your mind. And there's some, what we wanted to include that in the doc, because I think rarely do you get into the sort of psychological and emotional aspects of being a 19-year-old black man in his own town, in his own community, being stopped constantly. Like, what does that feel like? It's incredibly dehumanizing. So I think if there's anybody who's fatigued around that, it is that young man, and a lot of young men like him that we know from the statistics were stopped all the time. You talked a little bit about shaming. I don't think conversations about race are worthwhile if anybody's being shamed, right? Whether it's framed as, you're the oppressor and I'm the oppressed, or whether it's, you're the oppressed and shut up already because we're sick of hearing you whine about stuff, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I think both of those are useless conversations, right? And we'll play some clips of similar conversations. We saw it a lot, actually, around the Eric Garner conversation. You talk about policing, suddenly the conversation goes to black fathers. You talk about policing, suddenly the conversation is black on black crime. Not white on white crime, not Asian on Asian crime, but black on black crime. You know, so there's a certain game that's being played. I believe there's a fair amount of evidence of that. Ultimately, none of that is good for a productive conversation. Shaming in a conversation is useless. You have to bring people to genuinely want to figure out how to move the ball the direction to be productive and fix a lot of the issues that we see in America that we're a little bit far from.
You know, I always tell people that so-called race fatigue, so-called diversity fatigue, might be called sunrise fatigue. See, sunrise, sunfall. No matter what happens, every day, sunrise, sunfall. There's nothing you can get about sunrising and falling. So if you're tired of the sunrising and falling, sort of leave the planet. And if you're tired of conversations about diversity, when it's the new American reality, we will be majority minority by 2050, if not by 2040, when you look at the numbers and the trends. To talk about race fatigue, I mean, black people have been here. We're not going away. We built this country, quite frankly. So if you're tired, too bad. Latino people had portions of their land simply appropriated, as have Native American people. One of these tragedies is that we don't talk about Native American people and what's happened with them, to be 2% of the population to have been literally raped and robbed of their land, and to not have conversations, frankly, about reparations for that particular community. Well, if you're tired of it again, too bad. The population, despite the attacks on the Native community, with Native young people back in the day in the 30s and 40s, forcibly removed from reservations for their own good, taught the English language and encouraged not to use their own native language for their own good. Literally, forcibly immersed in Caucasian culture for their own good. That's the race conversation.
You know what I think is interesting about that, we'll talk about that this evening, is this idea that when we look at native populations today, we act as if where they are today came out of nowhere, right? It's just, we look at often poverty, we look at a lot of negative statistics, and it's kind of like, well, look at this culture, look what's happening here, with no real interest in investigating how we got here. And I think the same thing is often true if you look at the history of cities in America. If you look at the history of African Americans, we often sort of forget this past and kind of try to figure out, well, why is this wage gap? Why the wealth gap? Why? Well, it didn't just happen in 1985, it started. It clearly has its roots in slavery, into segregation, into Jim Crow. I mean, these things are American history. And so I think part of really giving people their due is to give their history its due as well.
And in terms of policing, I mean, people forget, Oakland, California's police were literally recruited from the Deep South in the 1950s and 1960s as Black people came to Oakland. So speaking of perceptions, these police officers from the Deep South felt so inclined to behave as if they were still in the Deep South. Beating, that's why the Black Panther Party emerged. Beating Black men randomly and indiscriminately. I mean, what the Panthers did at one point is had a member of the party shadow police officers to document the amount of police brutality, which is why the Panthers became group non grata in Oakland, California, and were frequently attacked. But the history piece is, why did you go to the deep side? Was there no one in Oakland to be a police officer? So you have to go to Mississippi in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? Well, guess what? You decided what you wanted.
Interesting points, because if you strip a society and people from a history, any history, and geography, you're going to have these conversations spiral around in circles, and increasingly more as we get into the digital millennium. Because if people are dismissive about what happened 4 years ago, they're going to have fatigue on what happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and they're not even going to even venture into 40 years ago, which has an immediate impact. So, and I only call Americans Americans. I call you the USAers, because I narrow it down to this lower 48 box here on this continent, and say that the history of where you're at, who you are, is everything. The history of Purdue sitting in West Lafayette on the borders of Illinois. You have to just know what, if the police was going to come from Mississippi and Alabama or Texas to go to Oakland. If you don't know these movements and these passages and these migrations of administration as well as people, then you know, anything said to you is just a bunch of hot digital air. And the problem is that with all the devices that people have, not to give any salute to a Wikipedia or Google, but damn, you can't freestyle it. And whether you're freestyling discussions or race with no sense of where anything is from or what happened, you look at news from how it is only going to relate to me and dismiss something that could be pertinent to even where you're at. It's not, nothing's going to happen. You're going to be deemed a slave to whatever comes at you. And so, yeah, you don't have bars. People might not be under barbed wire, but you're totally trapped into propaganda being at your helm if you don't pay attention to history or geography.
So I've been in Lafayette for 12, 13 years now, and I'm here for the same reason my white colleagues are here. Purdue is an excellent place to work. It's a wonderful cost of living here. Great schools. And I think a lot of times when people think of people of color, they think that we don't necessarily value the same things that they value. We do. But then also, when you bring in diverse people, you have to understand that you cannot stay exactly the way you are. You have to allow for the fact that you're bringing in different people. They may have different needs.